I'm here with Armin Krishnan, who is a political scientist from Germany, currently based in the US. How are you doing, Armin?
I'm great. Thanks for having me.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thanks very much for coming on. So, if you don't mind, Armin, could you introduce yourself a little bit?
Well, I'm an associate professor and director of security studies at East Carolina University. So that's a university in coastal North Carolina in the United States.
And what's your qualifications? What's your background?
Well, I studied philosophy, political science, and sociology at the University of Munich. And then I came to the United Kingdom, did another MA in intelligence studies, and got my PhD from Salford University in the area of security studies. So I was researching the defense industry and the changes that were taking place in the defense industry in the early 2000s.
Ah, very good. So is that what you actually do now? You lecture in security studies and defense?
Well, I have an interest in intelligence and covert operations, covert action. So I taught for 4 years at the University of Texas at El Paso, intelligence studies. And in 2013, I changed to East Carolina University and teach mostly foreign policy, international relations, and intelligence studies.
So for intelligence studies, like who exactly would be learning about that? What's the qualification? Why would they need to study intelligence? Is it for politics, mainly a career in politics?
Well, obviously our students want to work for the government. So in particular in the national security sector. And yes, they are interested in getting a job with an intelligence agency or with the State Department or perhaps with the private sector as well. So we also have lots of mid-career professionals. So we have a lot of military students. So the military is also a major market for intelligence studies.
What exactly piqued your interest in the topic?
You mean intelligence? Well,
yeah.
I've always had a fascination with intelligence, so espionage kind of things. And I'm also interested in psychological operations, propaganda type of things. So that how it's linked in with covert action. And I have the opportunity to study that, to research that, and to teach it, which is a lot of fun.
So I spoke to you before, Dr. Krishnan, and you explained to me about security clearance and compartmentalization. Could you explain a little bit about what exactly that is?
Well, in the national security sector, you have secret information. And that means that it is classified according to a certain level. So there are 3 main classification levels: confidential, secret, and top secret. And in addition, there's also something called sensitive compartmented information. So that is, in a sense, a classification level above top secret. And you can get a security clearance for the respective level. So we have in the United States 2.9 million people who have a security clearance, and about 1.3 million people have a top secret clearance. Wow. And the way you get a security clearance is you have to apply for it with an agency, and they do a background check on you. So you have to fill out a standard form 86. So you have to give up all information about your life. So all the names you had, your family members, your passports, your travel, even information about your health, and your social circumstances, your finances, your military background, and so on. And if you can satisfy the examiners or the people who approve that, then you can get the security clearance. And at the top secret level and in the intelligence community, you also have to pass a polygraph exam. So they can ask you questions about whether you are a foreign agent or things like that, and they can evaluate your answer using the polygraph. So that's how you get the security clearance, and it has to be renewed every couple of years. So top secret clearance is good for 5 years, and a secret clearance is good for 10 years.
So you were saying what about 3 million people in the US have clearance, security clearance?
Yeah, that's correct. So that's a lot of people, and that has to do with the systematic overclassification of information in the US government. So there's a tendency to classify information at a higher level than needed, or to classify information that doesn't need to be protected. And yeah, in order for the government to function at all, they need to give out a lot of security clearances.
How many levels of security clearance are there?
3 basic levels. And then you get into the sensitive compartmented information area that is mostly related to intelligence, but can also be in other areas of national security. In addition to that, you have also something that is called special access programs. So that mostly relates to acquisition programs of the Pentagon. So when they develop a new weapon system, such as the new B-21 radar nuclear bomber, that would be protected as a special access program. And that means there are particular safeguards as to who can have what kind of information and how this information has to be handled.
How it's handled. So, I mean, basically what it is you have all the different compartments, everybody's working together, but they don't know exactly the project fully. They are separated into certain compartments to do specific jobs with specific expertise, but they don't know the overall picture. Would that be fair enough to say?
Yeah, absolutely. So the idea is that only a minimum amount of people knows all the information, or even a major part of the information. If you're the Secretary of Defense, there could be information that you're not cleared for because you don't have a need to know.
Wow. So they would be the ones who have the most information. They would be the super clearance.
Yeah, they are called super users.
How many super users might there be in the US alone, we'll say?
Well, according to the Washington Post investigation that came out in 2010 or 2011, and there are only a handful of super users. So very few people are super users. So that creates obviously an oversight and accountability problem, because there are way too many classified programs in existence. And a single human being simply doesn't have the time or would be able to look through all that information. So that makes it very hard to determine what's actually going on in the national security state, because there are too many classified programs. So if you only have a handful of super users, they don't have the time to look through all the classified information. If you think about it, it's like 50 million documents get classified. Get classified every year. That's 140,000 documents that get classified every day. And yeah, obviously, when it comes to special access programs, there may be hundreds of them in existence. And those special access programs may also have various kinds of sub-programs. And understanding what is really happening is extremely difficult, even if you are inside of that system.
Right. There's literally so much going on that you just wouldn't be able to keep up with it even as a super user.
Yeah, I don't think that presidents know a whole lot about the inner workings of the national security state.
Yeah, I'd imagine that they don't. It seems to me, and to many people, I think most of the public know that most of our politicians are kind of puppets for security state, and possibly even the deep state or shadow governments, you know.
Yes, and there is a huge concern that we are losing our democracy, so that there are outside interests that can manipulate the government and have an extraordinary influence on government decision making. And that we are kind of living in the illusion that we can influence government policies by voting or by otherwise participating in politics. But in reality, the decisions are made by others than the elected officials.
Yeah, undemocratically elected people, then you could say.
Yes, and here the national security state has acquired a lot of autonomy because of all the secrecy that exists in the national security state. So since it's so difficult to hold the national security state accountable for what they're doing, they can get away with pursuing their own policies to some extent, or they can oppose an elected administration or government and do their own thing. So an independent security state is when a state security apparatus achieved independence from the rest of the government and can pursue its own policies. Also in areas other than just national security. And yeah, there are a couple of examples of independent security states that have existed historically. So one example that I mentioned was the SS in Nazi Germany, which had its own intelligence apparatus, its own military, its own police, and its own prisons, and its own factories for generating profits that sustained it, so it could operate independently from the rest of the German government. And to a lesser extent, that also existed in the Soviet Union with the KGB, which also formed a state within a state. At least at times, the KGB was relatively autonomous from the rest of the Soviet government. At least they have had extraordinary powers. The national security state we have is not that extreme. So they have some autonomy, but they have not achieved independence. So they can't really function without at least some apparent consent from the elected government. However, we've seen during the Trump administration, there can be an open conflict between the national security state and the administration. So where the administration is trying to do one thing or pursue a certain policy, and the national security state says, no, we're not supporting that. We are doing our own thing. And there are a couple of examples during the Trump administration where that happened. So it shows you that they have some autonomy, but they still need to at least operate with the illusion that the elected government is in charge.
Yeah, I get you. And was that something that Trump was trying to break up, perchance, or was it just Trump being Trump?
Well, I think that all presidents, at least since Kennedy, faced that issue, that they were dealing with a national security apparatus that had their own ideas about how policies should be conducted and what kind of policies should be pursued. And if a president wanted to change that, they were in danger of facing some negative repercussions. So the national security state has the power to sabotage presidents. And I think one example here is what happened to Nixon. So I think the CIA set him up with the Watergate break-in, and they effectively removed the president because for one reason or another, Nixon had become a problem to the national security state. And I think that a similar thing happened to Trump. So we can clearly see that the FBI was working against Trump, and that they were actually suppressing information during the 2020 election, so the Hunter Biden laptop, and that the FBI was actually censoring Twitter. So anybody who wanted to tweet about that was kind of suppressed. That information was suppressed by the FBI. And clearly that's not what the FBI should do. So the FBI should remain neutral with respect to politics, but they are now highly politicized.
And that's the same. That was the same through coronavirus as well. They were able to suppress information on Twitter for that as well. I mean, you had actual scientists who were citing paper and evidence on some of the misgivings of the information that was being disseminated by the government about coronavirus, and it's found out now that they censored all of that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in the United States, we have the First Amendment. So there's, in theory, freedom of opinion. So you can express your opinions freely. However, if you want to use the internet to do so, you rely on IT platforms such as Facebook or Twitter or other kinds of online media, and then the government can go to those companies and tell them to censor certain information. So in a sense, it's not the government itself that is censoring, but it's using those IT companies as proxies for censorship. And that's a problem because we are relying so much on the internet for getting good information. And if we can't get that information, then that means that good information is not available and poor decisions are being made. And clearly, we had a lot of misinformation that was coming out of official sources. And there was no real corrective to that, at least the corrective to that was marginalized. So we had still a lot of people speaking out, but they could not get heard because of all the hidden censorship that was going on.
Yeah, and of course they really understand the you could call it the perception of the masses. So people are, I mean, there is a lot of cognitive control by governments and obviously deep state, where they understand the perception of the masses very well, and they understand that they will be believed with the information they release, even though many will be skeptical. So anybody on Twitter or Facebook that's trying to argue against what information is being disseminated by government will be labeled conspiracy theorists, and they don't really get listened to.
Yeah, that's a standard method. And yeah, it goes back to psychological warfare and propaganda research in the 1920s. So when many of the foundations for that were laid. So the governments have a lot of experience with how to shape public opinion, how to manipulate public opinion, and how to steer a society in a certain direction. And obviously we have a very important example with Nazi Germany, where the Nazi regime mastered the art of propaganda. And obviously other governments learned from that and perfected those methods. So it's very important to understand that we receive a lot of secondhand information from the media. So most of our information and our understanding of the world does not come from direct experience. It comes from the media. And if you can shape what information is presented to people, then you can shape their thoughts. And by shaping their thoughts, you can also shape their behavior. and move their behavior in a certain direction. And you can use all kinds of psychological tricks for accomplishing that. And obviously, propaganda relies heavily on the use of emotional appeals. So when you're using emotional messages, then you're kind of bypassing rational thought and rational debate. And that's how they can manipulate people. So another thing that is very concerning is that a lot of people have lost the ability to think critically about information. So they simply accept official or authoritative information as true without actually questioning whether it can be true or whether there are reasons that it may not be true. And yeah, I think only a small minority in Western societies is still able to think critically and to have an own independent opinion. And that makes it very easy for governments to steer societies.
Yeah, of course. So for example, the way they kind of you can't say they tie people down and force them to get the vaccines, but what they were saying was, if you don't take the vaccine, you're putting the lives of older people in danger, you're putting the lives of your family in danger. So people were, and that's where the emotional manipulation comes into it. People were scared, and you don't want to be responsible. At that time, people thought, okay, if I get coronavirus, someone could be dead who I know immediately, and I don't want that on my conscience. So people took the vaccine.
Yeah, I mean, it's a standard technique in psychological warfare. So you're looking for what kind of messages target audiences may be receptive to. And moral appeals are also very effective. So you have to present the desirable behavior as the morally right behavior and the undesirable behavior as morally wrong. And that's very important for people, because everybody wants to be a moral person. At least most people want to be a moral person. And most people have a desire to conform. So if something is presented as the norm, you don't want to be the one who is abnormal or asocial. And that's the trick that they're using in terms of convincing people to do things that they actually not really want to do. And it's very sad that we are at that point that many people in society can be manipulated in that way.
Yeah, it's really interesting that I think most people at this stage would realize that they were manipulated into taking the vaccines, and especially now there's a lot of information being released about that. But there doesn't seem to be much done about it. I mean, there are certain people who are on the forefront of trying to expose certain things, and you obviously had the information that was released by Twitter, but there should be uproar about things like that, but there's not.
Yeah, I think it's just conformism, and
Yeah.
people have other kinds of problems. So we are living in a world that seems to be falling apart. So people are struggling economically and financially, and we have so many negative things that are happening. So I think there's a lot of distraction happening as well. So we are already moving on to the next thing, whatever that is. And people are already starting to forget about the pandemic and about the freedoms that they've lost.
Yeah, I mean, I remember after the pandemic was kind of easing off, they immediately came in with global warming. It was all over the news. You had David Attenborough, Greta Thunberg. It was the daily story, and it was the big thing that we all had to get on immediately. But then the war in Ukraine started, and it was all done. It was the Ukraine propaganda, the Russian propaganda that immediately came back into it, and global warming was forgotten about.
Yeah, you can say Putin cured COVID-19.
Yeah. it looks like it. It looks like it because there's nothing much about it anymore. So Armin, I just want to touch a little bit on your book, Emerging Technologies, Ethics and International Affairs, a very interesting and unique kind of perspective on what's happening with military and developing technologies at the moment. That again, there isn't too much information out there regarding how advanced it is. So I know you're quite informed on the topic. So, like, what's the kind of positive and negative aspects of such technologies?
Well, the way it is sold and the way it is presented to the public is that it's all about human performance enhancement. So these are wonderful new things that we can use to perform better in our jobs, for example. So we are living in a competitive society. So we're competing for jobs and opportunities. So it's a good idea to be more competitive by having some enhancement. So in particular of your intelligence and your other abilities. And that's what neuroscientific research is promising people. That we can become smarter and that we can perform better and that we can be more successful using that kind of technology. And another aspect is safety and security. So there is the argument with neuroscientific advances and neurotechnologies, we can make it safer to drive a car or to operate other kinds of machinery, because we can monitor brain activity, and when somebody would fall asleep or would lose concentration, we can send an alarm and prevent accidents from happening. And then there are other kinds of applications in the area of national security. So we can use it for finding out whether somebody is lying or whether they're hiding information or whether they are truthful and so on. So there are many applications that look positive. So we can use it for the good of society. At the same time, the very same technology that can be used for human performance enhancement can also be used for human enslavement. So for one thing, there's a privacy issue. So once you're starting to monitor brain activity, others can understand how you respond to certain stimuli. And they can use that for manipulating you. So they know to what kind of stimuli you may respond or would respond and how you would respond. So you can present these stimuli and steer your behavior and thinking in a certain direction. So it could be the way that a company or corporation could manipulate people into buying more products, spending more money on things they don't need. Or in politics, it could be used for manipulating voters to vote for a certain party or to support a certain policy. So it's a very dangerous kind of thing. And then we also get into that area of brain stimulation. So we can also alter brain processes, and that can go as far as taking control over another body. By just stimulating a particular brain area, we can induce hallucinations. So that can be visual hallucinations or voices, so auditory hallucinations. So we can use it for something called synthetic telepathy. So we could manipulate, we could communicate with others silently. So there is a military application for that as well. So you might think of special operations forces. So they have to signal each other by hand. But if they could exchange thoughts, that would be much more effective in terms of coordinating their action and so on. So so there are a lot of dangers associated with that. And I'm very concerned that we lose our freedom and our ability to be independent individuals, and that we have free will and that we can make our own choices. Because if we are not careful, we are getting in a situation where we are constantly manipulated to do certain things, and that would diminish our lives. And I think there are also very important ethical implications of doing that.
Yeah, of course. And so I presume, actually you are, because you mentioned him in your book, Dr. James Giordano, who is the neuroethics advisor to the Human Brain Project, and I believe he also advises CIA. And I was watching a recent presentation he made called Battlescape Brain, where he says we currently have the technology to read and write into the brain in real time with the same technology that powers a cell phone. What would you think about this quote? I mean, are the military this advanced that they already have these technologies and are actually are trying them out, or they're actually using them already?
Well, honestly, I don't know. My opinion is that the human mind is much more complicated than neuroscientists think it is. And many neuroscientists believe that the brain is just a biocomputer. So you can program that, you can manipulate it, and the mind is just a byproduct of the processes going on in the brain. And I think that's a very simplistic understanding of what the human mind actually is. So yes, you can manipulate the brain and it will have an effect on a human mind. But I think there are huge limitations to that approach. So I think there is still something in the human mind that is not material and that cannot be captured by just looking at the brain. I mean, that's a philosophical position rather than a strictly scientific position. But I think this kind of materialist approach that neuroscientists take to the brain is just wrong. And there are limitations of what you can do. And yeah, there are ways of reading minds. So you can potentially understand thoughts. You can decipher what people see or hear by analyzing the particular brain regions and by monitoring brain activity and neural imaging and things like that. But it doesn't mean that you can get really to the mind and to the core of a personality. I mean, there is research that was done back in the 1950s and 1960s, and the person mostly associated with that is Jose Delgado, who wrote the book, The Physical Control of the Mind Towards a Psycho-Civilized Society, I think from 1968. And he was doing a lot of research where he was implanting electrodes into patients and then stimulating certain brain regions and then producing predictable effects. So he could switch a button and then the person would move an arm. And they would not be even aware that they moved the arm, or that and when he was making them aware that they moved the arm, they said, yeah, I decided to move my arm, and so what? So they didn't understand that they were remotely controlled. And he did this famous experiment with the bull. So he had a bull charging at him, and the bull had some implant in the brain, and he switched a button and he could bring the bull to a stop before the bull was hitting him. So you can see this kind of thing is known for a long time. And yeah, it can be done. We can take control of a person's body and to some extent also a person's mind using brain implants.
Wow. Yeah, and I believe I read a while ago that the Russians, maybe as far back as the 60s as well, or 70s, had come up with a technology that could put soldiers asleep or put them into some kind of a hypnotic or trance-like state.
Yeah, that's right. They were developing a device for interrogations. So they wanted to produce in a hypnotic state where people would be highly suggestible, and they could also control mental states with that. And that includes putting people to sleep or putting people into a trance-like mental situation.
Yeah, wow, interesting. And so you have, I know you're familiar with Dr. Len Burr, who is a Havana syndrome victim. As in he has been diagnosed with Havana syndrome and with vestibular damage, which can only be caused by pulsed energy weapons. He is a civilian. He doesn't work for the CIA or the FBI. He's in no way affiliated with them. I know a number of CIA and FBI agents actually were diagnosed with the same thing, and even though the higher ups in the CIA are claiming that they're kind of baffled by it, it seems unusual because there's a very long history involved in this. So and I know Dr. Burr, he says that these attacks are ongoing. It didn't happen just once. Would you have any input on that, Dr. Krishnan? What do you think might be happening there?
Well, my understanding of the Havana syndrome is that it's likely caused by some kind of directed energy weapon. So the initial suspicion was that it could have been an acoustic weapon. And that hypothesis was discarded. And one hypothesis that was proposed by the National Academy of Sciences report was that it was pulsed microwaves. So we know that there are thermal effects of microwaves that can damage the brain and that can cause some of the problems that are experienced by Havana syndrome victims. So it can produce this kind of ticking noise that some of the Havana syndrome victims heard. So that's called the Fry effect, microwave auditory effect. So that was already observed, I think, back in the 1940s. And other effects is that it can cause this vertigo or nausea, where the people lose their balance. So that was also associated with microwave thermal effects. And yeah, I think a good case can be made that the attacks are being conducted with some kind of directed energy weapon and potentially something that's based on microwaves or radio frequency.
And I know it's a bit of an anomaly, but any idea why he might be experiencing? He would have experienced an attack in the first place as a citizen, or why it might be ongoing.
Well, I mean, there's a very long history of this phenomenon of targeted individuals. And I think it goes back even to the 1950s when the CIA started doing the mind control experiments. So they were conducting human experiments on some unwitting people. So these could be random civilians, could be people from the government or the military that were abused in those experiments. And yeah, I know that they also experimented with brain implants. And yeah, there are reports of implants that have been found in some of the victims. And I think that also goes back to the kind of 1960s or 1970s. So there's a very long history of people who are potentially victims of secret government experimentation. So it's very hard to prove. And yeah, obviously, the government denies that this would be happening. But I think there is some evidence. So they have found implants in some people, and nobody knew how they were implanted. So how people ended up with those implants. So I don't think that the Havana syndrome is necessarily a totally new thing. I think it's something that has existed for some time. Possibly the Havana syndrome is the result of a more sophisticated weapon.
Right, yeah, and there are, I mean, there's a lot of, if you go onto a Facebook page, there are a lot of people, and they have been for many years actually complaining about the use of microwave weapons on them. And for most citizens, it seems like a bit of a tall order, a bit of a crazy claim, because you know, it's very hard to believe that something like that, you know, actually a lot of people don't even realize that microwave weapons exist, so they find that hard to believe in the first place. But to think that citizens could be targeted in their own homes by such a thing is yeah, it's a hard one to swallow, I think, for most people.
Well, actually, it has happened in totalitarian systems that they have targeted individuals because of their political viewpoints. So they were coming after dissidents and political activists. So there are examples in the Soviet Union, and I'm aware of East Germany, where they were actually using a tactic called Zersetzung, or disintegration, which meant to socially isolate the person, so destroy their careers, destroy all family relationships and friendships. And there is some evidence that this happened in East Germany during the period of the communist regime. And I think it also happened in other communist countries. So that is not something that is new. And I think there is documentary evidence that this has happened. And I've read of one case where they were using an X-ray machine from the other side of the wall to harm another person in an apartment.
Yeah, I heard that actually, that it's possible, for example, Russia could use, possibly use microwave weapons from a satellite or something like that to target US citizens. I can't remember exactly where I read that, but I thought that yeah, this was something that happened many years ago, and it might have even made a little bit of news. Did you hear anything about that at all?
No, I mean, I'm aware that the Soviet Union did a lot of unorthodox scientific research, especially after the period of Stalin's death. So there was a revival of unorthodox research, and some of that was psychic research, and related to that was so-called psychotronic weapons, and they also called it psychotronic generators. So that was based on the idea that the brain uses electromagnetic fields, and that this could be used for certain psychic phenomena, and in particular things like telekinesis, telepathy, and also remote viewing. That was another thing that they researched. And yeah, that was also linked to directed energy weapons research. And because of this idea that of the electromagnetic nature of the human body. And the Russians were far ahead in that compared to the West. But I think you can even go back to the Russian Revolution, the October Revolution, and what happened afterwards. So they were already trying to develop mind control techniques for the new Soviet or Bolshevik regime. And they were using behavioralism. So they were trying to condition people, and they were trying to brainwash people. And that is the use of deprivation, torture kind of things in order to shape the behavior of people and to make them controllable. And that was kind of pioneered by the communists. And then in the 1930s and 1940s, Western governments also became interested in that kind of phenomenon of behavioral control, also in relation to intelligence type of problems. So in 1943, the OSS started a research program that involved hallucinogenic drugs. So they were in particular interested in mescaline as well as in scopolamine. And it was developed as interrogational drugs. So they wanted to extract information from people who were not cooperative. And they were looking for drugs that made people particularly suggestible and that kind of relaxed their inhibitions and that made them more likely to spill some secrets. And that's how it really started in the United States. And after the war, there was a research effort by the Navy involving interrogation and various kinds of drug-related research. And that became then Project Bluebird by the CIA, which was another effort to develop new techniques for interrogation and for controlling agents. So that was all from the perspective of espionage and how you can control agents, especially if they're not cooperative. And that became Project Artichoke, I think in 1951, which morphed into a program for developing mind-controlled assassins. So these are the Manchurian candidates. So they were trying to use hypnosis in order to create alternate personalities that could be programmed to carry out a particular task when they are triggered. And yeah, there are some very interesting documentation of Project Artichoke, and there are some anecdotes that suggest that they were actually able to do that. So at least some people can be hypnotized and controlled by hypnotic commands. And yeah, there was more research with respect to disassociating personalities. So create multiple personalities and then program different personalities.
Kind of it was like emptying the mind or something they called it, and then reprogram or rebuild in according to their needs.
Yeah, that was under MK Ultra. So MK Ultra started in 1953 under Alan Dulles, and that involved research by Ewan Cameron in Canada at McGill University, Allen Memorial University. So he was doing something that he called depatterning and psychic driving. So he was essentially torturing his patients. He was a psychiatrist and was trying to change their behavioral programming. And he was using electroshocks and sleep deprivation and other deprivation, and even inducing the artificial coma. And he was using recordings with messages that they had to listen to over and over again. And patients were subjected to that for extended periods of time. And essentially, he was destroying their personalities, so that he was really harming the patients. And that was done with funding from the CIA.
Yeah, I seen something about court cases that happened around Clinton's time where victims of those experiments were suing the government. And actually, there was one particularly disturbing case that I seen where a lady was saying, this one was, I think it was a Dr. Green, who was an ex-Nazi, one of the scientists that they brought to the US in Project Paperclip. And she was claiming that he was experimenting on her as a child with mind control weapons, I think it was, and lasers and microwave weapons and things like that. So they were actually experimenting on children in those days, which is deeply disturbing.
Yeah, I mean, that's not really proven, but it's very likely. So the minds of children are not developed, which means it's easier to program the minds of children and to create those kinds of phenomena such as dissociative personality disorder or multiple personalities disorder. So you can splinter the psyche of children much more easily than you can splinter the psyche of an adult. So if you want to create those kinds of Manchurian candidates, then you would likely prefer children for doing that, simply because it's easier to do.
So, I mean, with what we've been speaking about, the technologies that are available now, is it possible that this experimentation kind of led up to eventually becoming remote mind control? And they obviously have a plethora of experience in this area. So they've now developed technologies that where they can remotely do the experiments.
Well, I can give you an overview of MKUltra. So it was a very large research project. I mean, it was a set of research projects. There were 149 sub-projects that were funded through cutouts, the Human Ecology Fund and NIH. And in many cases, the scientists were not even aware that the money was coming from the CIA. And there were different directions in that research. So there was a lot of drug-related research, in particular with respect to LSD, but there was also a lot of behavioral research and hypnosis-related research. In addition, there was research that also involved electromagnetic waves and research that involved those kinds of brain implants. So they were definitely looking at remotely influencing people. And the way they could do it at the time was really with implants. So there was this research by Maitland Baldwin. He was subjecting monkeys to radio frequency and microwaves and to see whether there were behavioral changes. And then there was also research that I think was done at the Tulane University involving brain implants and so electrodes that stimulated certain brain areas and allegedly also involved human subjects.
And like what year are we talking here?
Well, that happened in the from 1953 to 1964. So that was the bulk when the MKUltra research was conducted. And from 1964 to 1972, there was an in-house program that was called MK Search, which was smaller.
Wow, so I mean, that's what, about 60 to 70 years ago. So if they did actually continue with those experiments and develop into technologies, we can only imagine where they are today with it.
Yeah, I mean, it would be surprising if they didn't find anything. So if you consider the duration of that research that we know about, and so that was already almost 20 years in MKUltra research. So if all of their research was a failure, why couldn't they figure that out within a few years? Why carry on for 20 years? And yeah, there was also other research that was happening around that time. That was Project Pandora. So that was in relation to the Moscow embassy signal. So so that was happening from I think around 1952 to 1976, when the Soviets were bombarding the US embassy in Moscow with microwaves. And that was detected, I think, in 1953 or so. And they were trying to figure out why did they do that. And there was a research project, Project Pandora, from 65 to 1970, and where they were trying to figure out whether there were any kind of behavioral effects of microwaves on humans. And that research was inconclusive. So there were some scientists associated to Pandora who said, yes, there are behavioral or bioeffects of microwaves, and there was real damage done to our diplomats. And then there was also the other opinion saying, no, actually, we couldn't find evidence that there were damaging effects of those microwaves. And yeah, there was another study done in 1978 by Johns Hopkins University. And they said, well, actually, we don't have any evidence for higher cancer rates. So probably it was nothing. So that's a mystery of the Cold War period. But clearly in the 1970s, people were still thinking that it's possible to have behavioral or other bioeffects of microwaves. And only, I think in the 1980s, it becomes very difficult to find any kind of information on that topic. It kind of disappeared, and my impression is it all went into the classified world, and we just can't get to it.
I mean, it's an incredibly disruptive technology, and if people were aware that, you know, or if it, you know, came to the forefront that the technologies were still being used today, I mean, it would probably cause mayhem, because you know, it's not something that people would like to think about, that they could be, you know, manipulated remotely. Is it possible that so microwaves nowadays, we're absolutely saturated in them with, you know, we've got 5G cell towers everywhere. I don't know how many satellites are in the sky, you know, they're going to be everywhere we go. Is it possible that they could be being used today to even pacify the public in certain ways, or manipulate emotions or anything like that, do you think?
Well, what we know about is the active denial system. So that's a weapon system that was declassified in 2000, developed in the 1990s, and it uses millimeter waves. And it causes a burning sensation on the skin, and it was developed as some kind of riot control weapon.
It was used in Australia, I believe, during coronavirus. Some protesters said they had used it.
I've heard that it may have been used.
Yeah.
So officially, it has never been used. They deployed it in Afghanistan, and then they decided, well, it's too controversial, so we're not actually using it. But the technology exists. So we know that we have some anti-personnel type microwave weapons. And the main example here is the active denial system. So we can induce pain in people over several hundred meters using those microwaves or millimeter waves. So the idea is that those waves would not actually penetrate the skin, or only thinly penetrate it, and that there would be no permanent bioeffects of that. But obviously you can torture people with that. So that's a general concern with all kinds of non-lethal weapons, that that they can be abused for torture.
Wow. And like what other kind of destructive, or what are they called again, non-lethal weapons are being used by military at the moment?
Well, the concept of non-lethal weapons was developed in the 1980s. And the way it was originally presented, it was mostly about things like tear gas, rubber bullets, and tasers. And the idea here that sometimes the military does not want to use too much force. So especially in a counterinsurgency situation or in peacekeeping, when you're dealing with civilians, so you want to use a minimum amount of force, and then you should have some non-lethal option. The concern that human rights people have is that non-lethal weapons can be abused. So it doesn't mean that when something is classified as non-lethal, that the effects are necessarily non-lethal.
Yeah.
So non-lethal weapons can have lethal effects when they are abused. So you can potentially kill somebody with a taser or with a rubber bullet.
Or the microwave weapons that were used in Moscow on the American embassy, that actually caused cancer in some of the embassy personnel, didn't it? I believe they died from
yes.
that.
Yes, there were some cases of cancer. And there's still a question whether those cancer cases are above the average for the population. And that was the argument of the Johns Hopkins University study from '78, that considering the general population cancer level, it was not different. However, there were some methodological mistakes that were pointed out in a different study from '96 by Goldstein, that indicates that there was indeed a higher cancer rate for embassy personnel in Eastern Europe. So I think that electromagnetic fields and microwaves can cause cancer. And we know that from our cell phones, right? So people who use their cell phones a lot and hold it close to their head, and they are warming their brain and they can cause brain tumors. I mean, that is pretty much established, that cell phones can have a carcinogenic effect.
Like dangerously high level of microwaves were being exposed to it, like from cell towers and cell phones and all of these things. I believe that Barry Trower, who here in the UK, he is ex-MI5 scientist, and he was saying that what the levels of exposure that they are saying that are acceptable and that we are exposed to are far higher than what we believe.
Yeah, absolutely. The Soviet scientists in the 1950s determined that electromagnetic field exposure was only was safe at the 100th of the level that was considered safe in the United States.
Wow.
So they had much more restrictive regulations with respect to microwave or electromagnetic field exposure in the Soviet Union compared to the West. So exposure to electromagnetic fields definitely affects your sleep and can affect other things in your body. So there is quite some research. I mean, some people are electrosensitive, and this means that they are suffering from the ill effects of electromagnetic fields much more than the average person. And even the average person has to be concerned.
Yeah, so it's very hard, if not impossible, to get away from it.
Yeah, it is very hard to get away from it.
And just one question, Dr. Krishnan, before we go. So it's just something I was wondering myself. So on the war in Ukraine, that's happening, or any war anywhere actually, I suppose. I read that on the these borders between China and India, that such Indian soldiers claimed that microwave weapons were and LRAD type weapons were used on them at some stage. Do you think that these are being used in the war at the in wars at the moment? And if not, why not? I mean, it seems a no-brainer that if you could affect people's emotions or potentially disable someone on the field without ever shooting a bullet, why would they not be using them, or do you think they are?
Well, I mean, you want to have lethal effects for the most part in real wars. I mean, you can use non-lethal weapons for softening up the target. So to make the target more vulnerable to a more lethal attack that follows. And that could be one motivation, but if your motivation is to actually kill people, why would you bother using non-lethal options? So it very much depends on what your military objective is. So if you're operating in a situation where you have a lot of civilians around and where you don't really want to hurt too many people, then non-lethal weapons would be best. If you're in a situation where you actually want to kill the enemy, you're not bothering with non-lethal options.
Yeah, well, it seems interesting that if you could remotely manipulate the mind, that it wouldn't be a good idea to kind of manipulate the mind of generals or leaders or captains to get them to make silly mistakes and then kill someone, you know?
Yeah, that's a possibility. So I don't know very much about it. I mean, I've read some rumors about directed energy weapons that were used in 2003 in the Iraq War. So you had some strangely mutilated bodies that seem to have been exposed to directed energy weapons. But I haven't seen any kind of evidence for that in the Ukraine war. I mean, I'm aware of the story with respect to the Indian soldiers, and that was disputed later on. That I mean, it's very hard to prove any of this because the weapons that are being used, or if they are used, they are classified. So governments do not acknowledge that those weapons exist. And if you say that they exist anyway, then you are a conspiracy theorist because you can't provide evidence for it.
But I mean, is it fair to say this is something that the US would always like to, and Europe, of course, particularly the UK, would kind of always put the blame on Russia for these kind of things if something nefarious activity was happening with regards to kind of highly developed technologies like these. Would the US, would China and all the other superpowers have to keep up with Russia? I mean, would they sit back and just kind of go, wow, look what Russia can do, or would they have to carry out such activities as well to keep up with the game, do you think?
But I think that the Soviet Union shared a lot of technology with the Chinese communists. So I wouldn't be surprised if they would have shared that kind of research with the Chinese. I mean, we know that China is also conducting a lot of research in unconventional or unorthodox types of weapon systems, in particular directed energy weapon systems. So I think that if the Russians have this technology, very likely the Chinese have that technology, and very likely the United States has that technology as well.
So going back to Dr. Len Baer, I mean, he is not a what do you call it, a dissenter in any way. I believe he's just a normal citizen, and I understand that there are some movements to take this to court at the moment and to see if they can reach a conclusion as to what's going on or who's behind it. So I know that this is something that if it is a highly classified technology and there is a kind of a national security threat, that might be a possibility. There is something like you mentioned in your book called secret privilege. Is it possible that they would just be able to quash something like this immediately?
Well, yeah, it's called state secret privilege. And the main idea here is that the government can withhold any kind of evidence from a court on the basis that it affects national security. So you can't actually use anything in court if it relates to national security. And that makes it very hard to bring any kind of substantive case against the US government when it concerns those kinds of secret technologies. I mean, the famous example goes back to the Obama era with the drones. So Obama used the state secret privilege to withhold information about drone strikes in US courts in order to avoid accountability for those strikes. So even despite the fact that the drone strikes were publicized, so that it was in the public domain, the government argued you can't use that information because it's national security.
Yeah. They like to be able to pull that card. With the development of technologies like Neuralink that Elon Musk is involved in, and I understand there's a whole lot of companies now actually bringing out such technologies. Do you think that all this information might come to the forefront eventually? It might become just public knowledge that they have the capabilities to do these kind of things, and in a few years' time, people might learn that they, and I might look back and think, oh right, they have had the ability to do this for a long time now.
Absolutely. I mean, they want to develop a brain-computer interface. So they want to connect human brains to computers and to the internet. So make it possible for people to receive information or to send information from their brain to others. And I think that kind of research that goes back many, many decades. So I think at least to the 1950s, and it's already very advanced. I mean, the main concern that one can have is that you need human experimentation in order to develop that kind of thing. And then you run into a lot of ethical issues. And obviously, they are using people who are disabled and who could potentially benefit from that research. But it's one thing to use that kind of technology to cure somebody. It's another, or at least assist somebody in their living. It's a totally different thing if you want to use that technology in a healthy person. Because there might not be a substantive benefit to that person and a lot of risk. So you have to test that technology on healthy people, not just on the disabled ones.
And you should also have their consent, I guess.
I mean, that is the Nuremberg Code. So that happened because of the Nazi doctors who were experimenting on concentration camp inmates against their will, including terminal experiments where people died as a result of it. And the international norm that was established is we're not conducting any human experimentation without the consent of the test subject. And there must be also a benefit for the test subject. So that complicates things very much if you want to roll that out to the general public.
Yeah, of course, but it seems like it would be absolutely impossible to develop such capabilities or technologies without experimenting on humans, because I mean, there's only so much you can do with monkey brains or the brains of rodents.
Absolutely. So, I mean, monkeys don't think. So if you want to develop some mind-reading technology, monkeys wouldn't work. I mean, so I think there has to be some human experimentation, and I think there is a lot of unethical and potentially illegal experimentation that has been conducted by governments in that area. And we know of examples from the Cold War era, and I can imagine that those kinds of experiments have continued. We just don't know about it because it's highly classified.
Yeah, it's not something that they're ever going to, well, not ever, but certainly not something that they would speak about at the moment, because it would cause serious problems in the public realm, I'd say.
Yeah, so I think that it happened in the 1990s under Bill Clinton that they actually changed the rules for human experimentation in the area of national security, and and that's a big concern because they get a lot of exemptions from the rules. So that is a huge problem with anything national security, because you're operating under a different set of rules and laws than when you're operating in the normal realm. And yeah, a lot of abuses can happen because of this.
Yeah, and I'd say I'd imagine, like, not only for military purposes or national security purposes, I'd imagine the data from these experiments would be practically invaluable, and could be very, it'll be very valuable to organizations. Like, I know the CEO of Google, I think it was, came out and said recently that in the next 10 years, it's possible that they would be able to completely upload a brain onto a hard drive.
Well, I've read about that since the 1990s. I mean, it's a staple in the transhumanist literature. They all dream about this idea of uploading their brains into a computer and living forever, and potentially uploading that brain then into a robot so that they can still live in a physical world.
Wow.
I think it's kind of crazy. I don't
Yeah.
think it's going to work. I mean, you can produce some simulation of a mind, but you're not going to be able to reproduce a human mind in a computer, because
Yeah.
it's just two totally different things. So the whole idea that the brain is just a biocomputer and the mind is just a byproduct of the brain processes, I think that's wrong. And that's the reason why we'll never get a computer program that is an actual human mind, or that has something called general artificial intelligence, or artificial general intelligence.
I mean, you're just uploading the brain processes, really. I mean, the neural networks, and I know they're already have artificial intelligence that has basically copied, I don't know, would you say, patterns of neural networks of the human mind to be able to function autonomously, which is a danger in itself, that a lot of corporations and government organizations are using at the moment. But I mean, to actually be able to upload the self, the soul, as it was. I mean, you're just uploading a virtual copy of the brain, but your experience of yourself, I'd imagine, is something that it would be very difficult to upload or copy.
Yeah, I mean, the brain is not a computer.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. So it seems like an impossibility, but it's a huge movement. Transhumanism is a huge movement, and a lot of people believe in it, and are really pushing for it, and they're saying that whether there is not very ethical practices in the journey to reaching there, that nothing's going to stop them from getting to that point, really.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of, I think it's almost a mental illness. It is this desire to live forever.
Yeah.
And to acquire godlike powers. And it's psychopathic. I don't know what to make of that, because it's just not part of our human experience. So you're not creating a human experience by uploading something into a computer.
If you had the opportunity, Dr. Krishnan, to use something like Neuralink, or I don't know, something that comes out in the future to make you feel more, to make you more happy all of the time, or even more intelligent, or able to let's just say more intelligent, or whatever that might take your fancy, would you use something like that, or not?
And I'm very skeptical of that technology. I mean, I think human performance enhancement in terms of intelligence is very hard. So it's very difficult to make humans smarter. And it's much easier to just enslave humans with that technology.
Yeah.
So I think it's not worth the risk. And that's the short answer. I wouldn't. I mean, there are certain things that can be beneficial. So maybe if it's a non-invasive device, like some brain stimulation device that can relax you, that can enhance your concentration, okay, that's fine. But going that far to implant something into my brain or into my body in order to have some performance enhancement, I think it's a very bad idea.
Yeah, yeah, I'm with you, and so they're already, as we were saying, they've already developed autonomous artificial intelligence that they've built on neural networks of the brain, or copied how the neural networks of the brain functions. If I'm right here, I think, and Elon Musk was saying, I seen an interview with him a while ago, and he was saying that. And now, obviously, that artificial intelligence, like a chatbot, for example, if you were to, it has immediate link to all of the information that's on the internet or fed into it. And Elon Musk was saying that he reckons in the future that we will be the same, that we will not be using devices. We won't be using laptops to find information, that we can be hooked up directly to this and we can communicate telepathically.
Yeah, it's pretty much a nightmare, because we would be becoming the Borg.
Yeah.
We would no longer be independent human beings or individuals. We would be all the time connected to a hive mind. And that would greatly diminish our human experience. And I'm definitely not in favor of any of this. So if people want to do it, okay, but it's not for me.
Yeah. For me too. I mean, whatever happened to art and love and laughter and human creativity, all those things that we really cherish, is what we should be really, trying to progress in, rather than, technology blindly.
But it's really a technology of enslavement. I mean, who determines what is performance enhancement? So if the performance enhancement is just to make you a more happy worker, who can work 18 hours a day without complaining, is that really what you want?
Yeah, exactly. It should be down to your individual desires and capabilities, really. But sure, I don't know. Hopefully in the future, people will cop on to the way it's going, and we'll somehow be able to regulate it a little bit better than we are at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, what can we do about it? I mean, there is a desire on part of some people to become enhanced, and I don't think it's going to work out for them. So for one thing, I don't trust the technology. I don't think we have necessarily the technology to produce something that is actually safe and that is kind of beneficial for the human experience. So I'm worried that people end up with brain implants that may fail after a couple of years, and then they have huge amounts of problems. I mean, imagine it's built by corporations, right? And maybe the corporation goes out of business, and then you're stuck with your brain implant. You might need an update, but you can't get it because the company no longer exists. I mean,
yeah. What do you do? Switch. What do you do when you need a new operating system?
Or if it runs on Windows, imagine that.
Oh God, yeah. Wouldn't that be terrible? Yeah. There'd be a lot of crashing and rebooting in that case. Well, look, Dr. Krishnan, look, I want to thank you very, very much for your time, and thank you for all the information, and for taking the time to do this. It's been very informative. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
My pleasure. I'm happy to do it again.
Yeah. I hope hope we can do it again and elaborate a bit more on certain topics. So yeah, thank you very much, and hopefully we'll see you again soon.